Man insults Chuck Norris on a first-class flight, then realizes his huge mistake. Chuck Norris stood in the first-class line, exuding effortless toughness. He wore a rugged, sleeveless denim shirt, unbuttoned just enough to show a hint of his legendary chest. His worn-out jeans, faded from years of action, sat perfectly over a pair of scuffed leather cowboy boots. A classic brown leather belt with an unmistakable Texas buckle completed the look, while his ever-present stoic gaze made it clear he was the real deal. Next to him, a man in an expensive suit watched with disdain, unable to hide his arrogance. First class, how the man muttered with a smirk what happened next would leave everyone on that plane speechless and change one life forever. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. Dallas. Fort Worth International Airport was alive with movement. People hurried past each other. Flight announcements echoed over the intercom, and the sound of rolling luggage filled the air. It was a place where time never seemed to slow down. Everyone was in a rush focused on getting to their destinations. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe, and hit the bell icon, because we have more inspiring stories coming your way. Among the chaos in the first-class boarding line stood a man who didn't quite fit the usual mold of the wealthy travelers around him, while others wore expensive suits, designer watches, and carried luxury briefcases. Chuck stood in the first-class line, exuding effortless toughness. He wore a rugged, sleeveless denim shirt, unbuttoned just enough to show a hint of his legendary chest. His worn-out jeans, faded from years of action, sat perfectly over a pair of scuffed leather cowboy boots. A classic brown leather belt with an unmistakable Texas buckle completed the look. Observant, unlike the people around him who constantly checked their phones or looked impatiently at the boarding gate, he seemed at peace, as if he had nowhere else to be. But in that exact moment, behind him, Carl stood with an entirely different presence. He exuded confidence, or rather an arrogance that demanded to be noticed. His black suit was pressed to perfection, his Italian leather shoes polished so well. They reflected the overhead lights. A luxury wristwatch peeked out from beneath his tailored cuff, and the subtle but unmistakable scent of an expensive cologne lingered in the air. Everything about him screamed wealth, success, and exclusivity. Carl surveyed the first-class line, nodding approvingly at those who like and belong their business, executive celebrities, and high-net-worth travelers. Then his eyes landed on Chuck. His expression shifted, instantly, his lips curling into a slight smirk. First Class B, muttered just loud enough for Chuck Norris to hear, his voice lack with sarcasm. Chuck turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. The word world is full of surprises. He replied, simply, his voice calm and unaffected. Carl's smirk widened as he let out a soft chuckle. He had expected Chuck to stammer or appear uncomfortable, but instead the man remained completely composed, as if the comment didn't faze him in the slightest. Carl wasn't the type to let things go so easily. He took a small step closer, lowering his voice slightly, but keeping the same condescending tone. Nothing personal, but you don't seem like the type who flies first class, he said, gesturing subtly to Chuck close. Chuck Norris didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head slightly as if considering the statement. Then, instead of engaging further, he just let out a small, polite smile. The line started moving forward. Without another word, Chuck Norris stepped ahead, leaving Carl standing there momentarily thrown off by the lack of reaction. He had been expecting some kind of defensiveness, maybe an excuse, but Chuck Norris had given him nothing to work with as Carl followed behind. He couldn't help but steal glances at the man in front of him. Something about Chuck Norris felt off, not in a suspicious way, but in a way that Carl couldn't quite put his finger on. There was a quiet confidence in him, an ease that didn't match his appearance. Carl scoffed internally. Maybe he got lucky. Maybe someone gifted him a ticket. There's no way he belongs here. And yet, as they walked toward the plane, Carl had no idea that he was about to be proven completely wrong. The first-class boarding announcement echoed to the airport speakers, and the passengers in the exclusive line started moving forward. Business, executive celebrities, and well-dressed travelers adjusted their expensive carry-ons and prepared to step onto the jet bridge. Among them was Chuck Norris, moving at his own relaxed pace, completely unbothered by the rush around him. Carl, standing just behind him, smirked to himself. He still couldn't wrap his head around the fact that this casually dressed man was flying first class. Maybe he won some kind of contest, he thought, or maybe someone bought the ticket for him. As they reached the boarding, Agent Chuck Norris handed over his ticket. The agent scanned it, nodded politely, and gestured for him to proceed. Carl, with his confident stride, stepped forward right after him, handing over his own first-class ticket, as if it were a badge of honor Walking to the jet bridge, Carl felt the familiar thrill of entering a space meant for the elite the moment he stepped onto the plane. The luxurious first-class cabin greeted him wide plush seats, personal service, and the kind of comfort most travelers could only dream of. He smiled, slightly relishing the exclusivity, but then as he glanced down at his boarding pass to confirm his seat, his confident expression faltered. Seat 6A. He lifted his gaze and scanned the cabin moving down the aisle until his eyes landed on his seat, and that's when he saw it. Chuck Norris was already there, settling comfortably into the seat right next to his. Carl stopped in his tracks for a moment, unable to believe it. His lips parted. Slightly in disbelief, his eyebrows drawing together. No way out. Of all the places on this plane, out of all the possible seat assignments, it had to be here. Chuck Norris noticed a hesitation, looked up at him, and gave a polite, knowing smile. Looks like we're traveling together then, he said calmly. Carl exhaled, sharply shaking his head as he stepped into row. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered under his breath. He sat down, placing his designer carry-on backpack under the seat in front of him with just a little more force than necessary. He still couldn't believe his luck, or lack of it. The flight attendants moved to the cabin, offering warm greetings and assisting passengers with their belongings. Carl leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, still processing the situation. He was used to first class being filled with people like him, powerful, wealthy, the kind of individuals who understood luxury, but this didn't make sense. After a few moments of silence, he turned to the rock, still feeling the need to assert himself. So what do you do for a living? He asked casually, though the edge in his voice hinted at something more. Chuck Norris, who had just finished adjusting his backpack under the seat, looked up with the same calm expression. I work in film, he replied simply. Carl raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Oh, I see, commercial, small-time stuff, he asked with a slight chuckle, already assuming the answer. Chuck Norris just gave a slight smile and shook his head, something like that. He responded. Carl smirked, shaking his head slightly as he turned back toward the aisle. Interesting, he muttered. The plane continued boarding, and the seats around him filled one by one, yet Carl couldn't shake the growing curiosity. Something about Chuck Norris didn't add up, and soon he would find out just how wrong his assumptions were. As the flight took off, Carl couldn't resist striking up a conversation, though not in a friendly way. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, and hit the bell icon, because we have more inspiring stories coming your way. So what do you do for a living? He asked, his tone filled with curiosity, but also assumption. Chuck Norris replied simply, I work in film. Carl raised an eyebrow. Oh, commercial, small-time stuff. Chuck Norris just smiled, something like that. Carl chuckled. Not everyone is meant for first class. Some places just aren't for certain people. Chuck Norris remained calm. I believe we all end up where we meant to be. The conversation was subtle, but the tension was growing. Other passengers were starting to take notice. The in-flight service began when the flight attendant reached their row. Carl made sure to notice a glass of champagne, please, something that matches the exclusivity of the seat. Chuck Norris, on the other hand, simply said, just water, please. Carl scoffed. Water in first class? You're wasting experience. Chuck Norris took the bottle, looked at it, and replied, Cal, sometimes simplicity is enough. Carl shook his head, smirking. That's the kind of thing people say when they settle for less passengers around them. Exchanged glances. Chuck Norris, still unfazed, simply responded, maybe. The best looks different for everyone. Carl wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone who didn't even seem to care. Life is like flying first class, Carl said, swirling his champagne. You work hard, earn your spot, and then you get to enjoy it. Some people are just lucky. Chuck Norris placked his water bottle on the trade table and finally turned to Carl. Luck or hard work, in the end, we all land in the same place, don't we? The words hit harder than Carl expected. The cabin went quiet. A few passengers nodded in agreement. Just then the flight attendant returned. Mr. Norris, the captain wanted me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards. A wave of realization spread through first class. Carl froze. Norris, he muttered. Passengers who had been quietly observing widened their eyes. Some even exchanged whispers. Carl turned back to Chuck Norris, now looking at him as if seeing a ghost. You're Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris just smiled. Is something wrong? Carl stammered, trying to find the right words. I didn't mean, I just didn't know. Chuck Norris sighed. Carl, what you said doesn't change just because you know my name now. The truth doesn't depend on who you're speaking to. It depends on how you treat people. Carl sat in silence. The weight of Chuck Norris' words settling the rest of the flight was quiet. Chuck Norris read his book complet, unbothered. Carl, on the other hand, couldn't stop replaying everything in his mind as the plane landed. Carl finally turned to Chuck Norris. I need to apologize, not because of who you are, but because I was arrogant. Chuck simply nodded. Take care, Carl, And with that, Chuck Norris walked away greeted by fans who approached him with warmth and admiration. Carl stood there watching, realizing that true worth is not in wealth, but in kindness and humility. We often judge people based on appearances, assuming we know their worth. But as Chuck Norris showed, true greatness isn't loud, it speaks through action. So, next time you find yourself in a moment of judgment, remember respect and humility never go out of style. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, and hit the bell icon, because we have more inspiring stories coming your way.